Why was she the only one who wasn't afraid? The screens had just gone black. Every light in the bunker flickered out, and the hum of machines died in a heartbeat. 200 tanks were crawling toward them across the desert. Yet Commander Nova. Destruction didn't move. She just stood there, her hands resting lightly on the cold edge of the console, as if she had known this moment would come. The others didn't. Panic rippled through the room like a crack in glass. Sergeant Martinez's voice was tight with fear. Johnson's hands hovered uselessly over dead keyboards. And young radar operators exchanged glances that carried the same unspoken thought. We're finished. But she wasn't panicking. She was thinking, calculating, listening to the silence in a way no one else knew how. 2 hours. That's what the prey spotter had said. 2 hours until the enemy armored division, the Iron Wolves, were at the gates. The same Iron Wolves who had chewed through 3 Allied outposts in less than a month. The same tanks that never slowed, never hesitated, never left survivors. And now they were coming here to Thunder Ridge, to her base, to her soldiers. She had 2,000 men and women behind her walls, each of them believing that the missile defense systems she commanded would keep them alive. Each of them counting on technology, on precision computers, on targeting software, on the cold reliability of machines. Now those machines were dead. Commander, without computers, the launchers won't fire straight. Johnson stammered, as if she didn't already know. They'll be fireworks, nothing more. Nova turned her head slowly, gray eyes locking on him. That gaze alone had silenced men. Twice his age, she didn't raise her voice, didn't let the panic touch her words. Who says we need computers? The line hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Nobody answered. They didn't know yet that she meant it. Her mind drifted for half a breath, just long enough to remember every moment that had carried her here, every time she'd been underestimated, every time her quiet precision had been dismissed as luck or obsession. Every late night she'd sat alone with a manual slide rule, running equations long after others had gone to sleep. Not because she didn't trust the machines, but because she wanted to understand what they were doing for, to prove she could still fight if they were taken away. But she never told anyone that, not yet. Now, as the bunker filled with silence broken only by shallow breaths, she walked to the far wall. The manual targeting station sat there, collecting dust, an outdated relic, analog dials, mechanical cranks, red and green indicator lights that belonged in a museum more than on a battlefield. No one ever thought they'd actually use it, until now. The chair squealed softly as she dragged it out and sat down. She laid her hands on the controls, like a pianist brushing the keys of a forgotten instrument. The weight of eyes behind her was almost unbearable. Officers watching with disbelief. Soldiers whispering, one or two muttering prayers. Enemy lead elements entering maximum range. The spotter called, voice quivering. 12 miles out and closing fast. Nova's eyes narrowed on the manual targeting grid. A flood of numbers crashed into her headwind speed, crosswinds, elevation, atmospheric density, speed of advance. Where another commander would see chaos, she saw pattern. She saw the geometry of war. Loading first missile, she said softly. The words were steady, stripped of fear. Johnson sputtered. Commander, with respect, manual targeting is impossible. The equations, the timing, it can't be done fast enough. Her hand brushed the dial, adjusting elevation by half a degree. She didn't look at him. Watch me. The silence was total now. Even Martinez's breathing had slowed, as though the entire bunker leaned in to hear if she could really do what she was about to attempt. Her lips moved slightly, whispering. Numbers only she could follow. Trajectory, velocity, range. 11.8 miles. Tank speed, 35 miles per hour. Crosswind, 12 knots northeast. Adjust 3/10 left. Elevation plus 0.9. Her finger hovered over the firing switch, and she hesitated just long enough to hear her own heart pounding in her ears. If she was wrong, if the missile flew wide, if it detonated harmlessly in the desert sky, her people would lose more than just a shot. They would lose hope. Do it, she told herself. You've trained for this. Trust the math. Trust yourself. She pressed the switch. The bunker shuddered as the missile ignited, streaking into the sky with a roar. For an instant, it seemed to curve wrong, as though it would veer wide into emptiness. Every chest in the bunker tightened, every pair of eyes widened. Then, 11 miles away, a thunderclap. A fire erupted. A tank 30 tons of steel was torn apart in a plume of smoke and flame. The room froze. Direct hit, the spotter whispered, his voice shaking. Enemy lead tank destroyed. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was something. Closer to reverence, Johnson finally broke it, his voice hoarse. That's impossible. Nobody can calculate that. Not by hand. Nova was already moving, her fingers dancing over the dials, resetting for a second shot. Her breathing steady, her pulse low. She didn't answer him. Not yet. She didn't have time for wonder. She only had time for precision. Target 2, she murmured. Range, 11.9 miles. Adjust for evasion. The second missile roared into the sky. Another distant fireball, another kill. Now the enemy column began to shift. Breaking its formation, they weren't machines. They were men, and men bled fear. She could feel it in the pattern of their movements, even before the spotter called it out. The Iron Wolves weren't invincible anymore. They were prey, hunted by a single set of hands in a bunker they couldn't see. Inside, her soldiers were staring at her differently now, awe creeping in, fear being replaced with something else. Belief, Martinez finally asked, almost afraid of the answer. Ma'am, how are you doing this? Her eyes never left the grid. Her hands never paused. 20 years of practice. I didn't become a commander because I trusted computers. I became one because I understood what they were doing. She made another adjustment, her face lit faintly by the red glow of the outdated dials. Physics doesn't need electricity. Another missile. Another fireball on the horizon. Another Iron Wolf crushed beneath her impossible arithmetic. For the first time, Nova let herself exhale. Not in relief, but in focus, like a marksman finding her rhythm. Like a pianist sliding into the melody she'd practiced all her life. This was what she had prepared for. Not the glory of command, not the admiration of medals, but the quiet moment when everything failed, and she had only her mind left to fight with. Yet even as the fireballs painted the desert sky, a shadow of doubt lingered inside her. She knew her focus could not break. Not once, not for the next 2 hours. Every variable mattered. Every calculation had to be perfect. One mistake, and 2,000 lives would burn with the base. But she didn't let them see that. She let them see only the steel. Because if she was anything, she was the commander who made the impossible look inevitable. And deep down, behind the quiet certainty, one thought still gnawed at her like shrapnel in the dark. How long can I keep this up? Why did the enemy hesitate? Through the haze of smoke and desert heat, their armored columns faltered. For the first time in their campaign, the Iron Wolves slowed. Nova could almost feel their hesitation across 11 miles of burning sand. They had expected resistance, yes, but not this. Not surgical strikes landing without a single miss. Not precision so perfect, it defied the very laws of probability in his command tank. General Klov lifted binoculars to his eyes. He had led men for 40 years, and he recognized fear when it spread. But this was something stranger. His tanks were dying one by one, as though the battlefield itself had turned against them. His intelligence reports had been clear. The Americans' automated defense systems had been wiped out by the electronic strike. They should have been helpless, but they weren't. He lowered the binoculars slowly. Someone is doing this, he muttered, but no one can. back in the bunker. Nova didn't hear his words, but she felt the weight of them. Each missile she launched carried more than steel and explosives. It carried disbelief. It carried terror. And it carried the fragile hope of every soldier huddled in Thunder Ridge. Her crew watched in reverent silence now, afraid even to interrupt her rhythm. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat and heated metal, the faint mechanical groan of old equipment coming alive after years of neglect. Johnson wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, his disbelief still not dulled by repetition. "Target 7 destroyed," the spotter whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Nova didn't look up. Her lips barely moved, whispering numbers faster than most men could write. Each calculation was a heartbeat. Each adjustment was an instinct. Sharpened by decades of discipline, inside her, though, the conflict raged. She could feel exhaustion creeping closer. A predator waiting for her first mistake. Her mind was processing faster than machines, but it came at a cost. The equations burned behind her eyes like fire. She knew she couldn't falter. She knew one slip would cost everything. Don't let them see the cracks, she reminded herself. They need your strength more than you need rest. Outside, another explosion lit the desert horizon. The bunker shook faintly from the force, though the enemy was still miles away. Soldiers inside pressed closer to the narrow viewing slits, watching the impossible unfold in real time. They began to whisper her name, not her title, not her call sign, but simply Nova, not out of command, but out of something far heavier, belief. "Target 9 destroyed," the spotter announced, his voice steadier now. The disbelief was turning into rhythm. 2. Even the crew had started to fall in step with her impossible cadence. But General Klov wasn't ready to surrender belief. His mind raced as quickly as hers, though in different directions. His aide, pale and sweating, leaned close. "Sir, our electronic warfare confirms. Their systems are dead. This isn't technology." Klov's jaw tightened. "Then it's a human, but no human can." He cut himself off, watching yet another of his prized iron wolves vanish in a column of flame. Unless, he said nothing more, but inside, for the first time in decades, the old general felt something he despised. Doubt. Nova adjusted dials again, but her mind wasn't entirely on the math. Between numbers and angles, she caught glimpses of herself reflected in the dusty glass eyes hollow from strain, skin pale from bunker light. She wondered if her soldiers could see through her armor. Wondered if Martinez noticed how her fingers trembled for half a second before she steadied them again. But she couldn't let them know. They saw her as invincible now, and she had to be. "Ma'am." Martinez finally whispered, breaking the long silence. "Permission to speak freely?" "Granted," she said, her eyes never leaving the grid. He hesitated. Then, carefully, "You're carrying all of us. Alone. Don't you ever—" He stopped, struggling with the weight of the thought. "Don't you ever wish you could just step back? Let someone else take it?" Nova's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite bitterness. "Every day, Sergeant. But wishes don't stop tanks." She fired again. Another fireball. Another Iron Wolf reduced to wreckage inside. The tension shifted. Soldiers no longer whispered in fear, but in awe. Some began to cheer after each strike, though the sound was quickly hushed by officers who knew silence was better fuel for concentration. Still, the mood was changing. The base was no longer waiting for death. It was watching a miracle. Yet Nova knew miracles had limits. Each missile required energy she couldn't replace. Not physical energy, those reserves she could push beyond. It was the mental strain, the relentless demand of perfect focus, that threatened to break her. Numbers spun endlessly. Calculations layered upon calculations, each one fragile as glass. One mistake would shatter everything. She imagined the weight of 2,000 soldiers balanced on her fingertips, and wondered how much longer she could hold them, and still she Didn't stop. Target 16 destroyed, the spotter said with rising certainty. Target 17. His voice faltered, eyes wide. Destroyed. Nova's breathing slowed. She could feel the battlefield shifting beneath her fear, spreading through the iron wolves like cracks in ice. They were maneuvering differently now, less like predators, more like prey. She adjusted for another shot, but in the quiet between numbers, she let herself think a thought she hadn't allowed before. What if they realize I'm only human? Because she was. No matter how perfect the rhythm, no matter how flawless the shots, she wasn't a machine, and fatigue was already gnawing at her precision like rust on steel. Still, she pushed. Still, she calculated. Still, she fired. In his command tank, Klov lowered the binoculars once more. His aide was nearly shouting now. Sir, 20 tanks destroyed in under 15 minutes. The hit rate is perfect. Nobody has ever done this. Klov's voice was low, almost reverent. Then, we are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting something else. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The explosions in the distance were real enough. The accuracy undeniable. Somewhere, someone was proving that the impossible was only another word for untried. Back in the bunker, Nova's hands moved faster, steadier, sharper. She had entered a zone beyond fear, beyond exhaustion. Each calculation was instinct now. Each adjustment as natural as breathing. It wasn't just math anymore. It was music, a deadly symphony she alone could conduct. Target 23 destroyed, the spotter called. Target 24 destroyed. The cheers this time couldn't be contained. The bunker erupted, voices rising in disbelief, in joy, in sheer human relief. For a heartbeat. Thunder. Ridge felt unbreakable, but Nova didn't look up, didn't celebrate. She only whispered, too softly for anyone else to hear. How many more? Because the answer was simple and brutal. Too many. Why did the battlefield suddenly go quiet? For nearly an hour, the desert had been alive with fire, explosions, the grinding churn of tank treads. But now, as the iron wolves pulled back into the haze, there was silence. A silence too heavy, too deliberate. It wasn't retreat. It was thought. Nova leaned closer to the analog grid, sweat trickling down her temple. She could almost hear the enemy's mind working across the dunes. General Klov wasn't a man who surrendered to fear. He was recalculating, adapting, and she knew the next wave wouldn't come in a neat column. Her fingers rested on the controls, but her chest tightened with something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Uncertainty. For the first time since the systems went dark, she asked herself the question no commander should ever let surface. What if I can't hold them again? Behind her, the command bunker hummed with a different energy now. Not panic, but adrenaline. Soldiers who had been staring into the jaws of death less than an hour ago now clung to the hope she had ignited. Their belief in her was fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table. One crack, one failure, and it would all shatter. Martinez stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Mom, they're regrouping. We should prepare for a flanking maneuver. I know, Nova said. Her voice was calm, but her stomach tightened. She had expected this. They won't come straight at us again, not after what they've seen. Her eyes scanned the backup maps, crude lines drawn by hand, marking possible approach routes. East Ridge, Northern Pass, dry riverbed to the west. Each one a dagger aimed at her base. She lifted her chin slightly. Spotters. I want eyes on every approach. Report movement instantly. They'll try to stretch us thin. The orders rippled through the room, and soldiers scrambled to their posts. Nova stayed seated, her body rigid against the strain, her mind already running the numbers for shots she hadn't yet taken. She had to stay ahead. She had to be ready before the enemy moved. And then it came the distant rumble. Not one column, but three. Dust plumes rising from different directions. Faint but unmistakable. The iron wolves were spreading, testing her reach, daring her to match them shot for shot. Johnson's voice cracked. "Ma'am, they're coming from the north and the east, and another group circling west. That's too many angles." Nova didn't flinch. "Load the tubes, we'll cover them all." But inside, she knew the truth. She was only one mind, one pair of hands, and her body was already trembling from the relentless strain of perfection. The equations were coming harder now, slower, like dragging weights through sand. Her concentration threatened to fracture with every new variable. She closed her eyes for half a breath, whispering silently to herself, "Stay with me. Stay sharp. One mistake, and they die. You don't get to break. Not now." Her hands moved again, dialing in adjustments. Faster than anyone else in the bunker could comprehend. Target range 12 miles. "East flank," she said. Missile launch, fireball, cheers erupted. Louder this time, but Nova didn't hear them. Her head throbbed, numbers colliding behind. Her eyes, pressing her further than she had ever gone before. North flank at just 4 degrees. She ordered. Another missile. Another explosion. Soldiers clapped each other's shoulders, hope swelling with each impossible strike. But even as the desert lit with fire, Martinez caught what the others didn't, the slight tremor in her hand, the faint shadow beneath her eyes. He leaned closer again, his voice tight with worry. "Commander, how long can you keep this up?" Her jaw clenched. She didn't look at him. "As long as it takes." It wasn't an answer. It was a vow. Out on the battlefield, Klov's tanks kept falling, but not without teaching him. He saw the pattern. He saw the way his forces crumbled. Every time they advanced in groups, his eyes narrowed, fury burning in his chest. "She's one woman," he muttered. "One mind. She cannot cover every angle at once." And so he tried, splitting forces thinner, forcing multiple approaches, testing her human limits. Back in the bunker, Nova felt the trap tightening. She was firing faster, calculating harder, every shot a war between precision and exhaustion. Sweat dripped into her eyes. Her shoulders ached from the constant tension. Each equation carved into her like a blade. Target 29 destroyed. The spotter shouted. Her hand slipped slightly on the dial. Just a fraction. She steadied it instantly, but her breath caught in her throat. That slip hadn't cost her a shot. Not yet, but it was a reminder. She was cracking, and she couldn't afford to. She pressed her palm flat against the console, grounding herself, forcing the tremor in her hands to still. She thought of the 2,000 lives behind her, the men and women who had no one else to depend on. She thought of what would happen if she failed, if the base fell, if the Western Front collapsed because of her. The fear twisted in her stomach. But she didn't let it show. She swallowed it, buried it, turned it into steel. "Load next missile," she ordered, voice steady again. Another roar, another fireball, another Iron Wolf consumed, but Klov saw it too, the hesitation. The half-second longer between her shots, the faint gap in her rhythm. He pressed his hands against the command table, eyes burning. "She's not a machine," he said to his aide. "She's flesh. She break." In the bunker, soldiers continued to cheer, to believe. But Nova knew the general was right. She was flesh. She would break. The only question was when, and still, she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this wasn't about glory or medals or even survival anymore. It was about something far deeper, something she could never quite put into words. The dignity of not surrendering, the quiet vow she had made long before she wore the uniform. That she would not let others die because she was afraid to fail. Another missile, another fireball, another impossible calculation burning through her skull. But in the silence between detonations, the unspoken truth pressed closer. What happens when the last missile is gone? Why did the battlefield suddenly go quiet? For nearly an hour, the desert had been alive with fire, explosions, the grinding churn of tank treads. But now, As the iron wolves pulled back into the haze, there was silence. A silence too heavy, too deliberate. It wasn't retreat. It was thought. Nova leaned closer to the analog grid, sweat trickling down her temple. She could almost hear the enemy's mind working across the dunes. General Klov wasn't a man who surrendered to fear. He was recalculating, adapting, and she knew the next wave wouldn't come in a neat column. Her fingers rested on the controls, but her chest tightened with something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Uncertainty. For the first time since the systems went dark, she asked herself the question no commander should ever let surface. What if I can't hold them again? Behind her, the command bunker hummed with a different energy now. Not panic, but adrenaline. Soldiers who had been staring into the jaws of death less than an hour ago now clung to the hope she had ignited. Their belief in her was fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table. One crack, one failure, and it would all shatter. Martinez stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Mom, they're regrouping. We should prepare for a flanking maneuver. I know, Nova said. Her voice was calm, but her stomach tightened. She had expected this. They won't come straight at us again, not after what they've seen. Her. I scanned the backup maps, crude lines drawn by hand, marking possible approach routes. East Ridge, Northern Pass, dry riverbed to the west. Each one a dagger aimed at her base. She lifted her chin slightly. Spotters. I want eyes on every approach. Report movement instantly. They'll try to stretch us thin. The orders rippled through the room, and soldiers scrambled to their posts. Nova stayed seated, her body rigid against the strain, her mind already running the numbers for shots she hadn't yet taken. She had to stay ahead. She had to be ready before the enemy moved. And then it came the distant rumble. Not one column, but three. Dust plumes rising from different directions. Faint but unmistakable. The iron wolves were spreading, testing her reach, daring her to match them shot for shot. Johnson's voice cracked. Ma'am, they're coming from the north. And the east, and another group circling west. That's too many angles. Nova didn't flinch. Load the tubes, we'll cover them all. But inside, she knew the truth. She was only one mind, one pair of hands, and her body was already trembling from the relentless strain of perfection. The equations were coming harder now, slower, like dragging weights through sand. Her concentration threatened to fracture with every new variable. She closed her eyes for half a breath, whispering silently to herself, "Stay with me. Stay sharp. One mistake, and they die. You don't get to break. Not now." Her hands moved again, dialing in adjustments. Faster than anyone else in the bunker could comprehend. Target range 12 miles. East flank, she said. Missile launch, fireball, cheers erupted. Louder this time, but Nova didn't hear them. Her head throbbed, numbers colliding behind. Her eyes, pressing her further than she had ever gone before. North flank at just 4 degrees. She ordered. Another missile, another explosion. Soldiers clapped each other's shoulders, hope swelling with each impossible strike. But even as the desert lit with fire, Martinez caught what the others didn't, the slight tremor in her hand, the faint shadow beneath her eyes. He leaned closer again, his voice tight with worry. "Commander, how long can you keep this up?" Her jaw clenched. She didn't look at him. As long as it takes. It wasn't an answer. It was a vow. Out on the battlefield, Klov's tanks kept falling, but not without teaching him. He saw the pattern. He saw the way his forces crumbled. Every time they advanced in groups, his eyes narrowed, fury burning in his chest. "She's one woman," he muttered. "One mind. She cannot cover every angle at once." And so he tried, splitting forces thinner, forcing multiple approaches, testing her human limits. Back in the bunker, Nova felt the trap tightening. She was firing faster, calculating harder, every shot a war between precision and exhaustion. Sweat dripped into her eyes. Her shoulders ached from the constant tension. Each equation carved into her like a blade. Target 29 destroyed. The spotter shouted. Her hand slipped slightly on the dial. Just a fraction. She steadied it instantly, but her breath caught in her throat. That slip hadn't cost her a shot. Not yet, but it was a reminder. She was cracking, and she couldn't afford to. She pressed her palm flat against the console, grounding herself, forcing the tremor in her hands to still. She thought of the 2,000 lives behind her, the men and women who had no one else to depend on. She thought of what would happen if she failed, if the base fell, if the Western Front collapsed because of her. The fear twisted in her stomach. But she didn't let it show. She swallowed it, buried it, turned it into steel. Load next missile, she ordered, voice steady again. Another roar, another fireball, another iron wolf consumed, but Klov saw it too, the hesitation. The half-second longer between her shots, the faint gap in her rhythm. He pressed his hands against the command table, eyes burning. She's not a machine, he said to his aide. She's flesh. She'll break. In the bunker, soldiers continued to cheer, to believe. But Nova knew the general was right. She was flesh. She would break. The only question was when, and still, she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this wasn't about glory or medals or even survival anymore. It was about something far deeper, something she could never quite put into words. The dignity of not surrendering, the quiet vow she had made long before she wore the uniform. That she would not let others die because she was afraid to fail. Another missile, another fireball, another impossible calculation burning through her skull. But in the silence between detonations, the unspoken truth pressed closer. What happens when the last missile is gone? Why did her hands stop moving? For hours they had danced without pause, calculating, adjusting, firing, killing. But now, with one missile left and the rumble of tanks closing like thunder, her fingers hovered above the controls, still as stone. Every eye in the bunker fixed on her, waiting, hoping, dreading. "Commander," Martinez said quietly, almost reverently. 2 enemy tanks. Less than a mile out, 1 missile left. The words pierced the silence like a bell toll. 1 missile, 2 tanks. A problem no commander could solve. Johnson's voice cracked. "Ma'am, even if you hit one, the other will breach the perimeter. It's over." But Nova didn't look at him. Her gray eyes stayed locked on the grid, on the crude lines and dials that had carried them through the storm. Her face was unreadable, but inside, her chest ached with the weight of 2,000. Lives pressing against her lungs. Her mind screamed for a solution. Trajectories, velocities, distances, all the numbers that had saved them again and again. This time, they betrayed her. The math was merciless. 2 targets, 1 shot, for a heartbeat. She let herself feel the truth she'd been burying all day. She was human. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her mind frayed at the edges, and for the first time, she couldn't see the path forward. And then, she saw it, not in the tanks, not in their armor, their movement, their speed, but in the ground itself, the ridgeline that towered above the desert floor. Jagged and heavy, waiting, her breath caught. The idea was madness, an equation with no precedent. Fire not at the tanks, but at the earth itself. Strike the outcrop. Trigger a controlled collapse. Bury them beneath stone. It was insane. It was perfect. Her hands steadied on the dials. "Commander?" Martinez's voice quivered. He saw where she was aiming. You're not locking on either tank. Trust me," Nova whispered. She made the adjustments tiny, delicate, every fraction of a degree carrying the weight of the world. Her lips moved with the numbers, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Distance, angle, density of rock, force of blast, trajectory of falling debris. Behind her, the room was silent. No one dared breathe. She pressed the switch. The missile roared from the launcher, streaking skyward with a white contrail that arced toward the ridgeline. Soldiers gasped, Some shouted. Johnson buried his face in his hands, and then the horizon shattered. The missile struck the outcrop dead center. A thunderclap rolled across the desert as rock fractured and split, cascading in a roar louder than any engine. Hundreds of tons of stone and dust cascaded downward in an unstoppable tide. The two tanks never had a chance. They were swallowed whole, crushed beneath the avalanche. Metal screamed, engines died, and then there was nothing but silence and dust. Spotter's voice broke through, trembling with awe. Both targets destroyed. Base secure. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The bunker was frozen, time itself holding its breath. Then the sound erupted. Cheers exploded from every corner. Raw and unrestrained, soldiers leapt to their feet. Voices breaking, tears streaming down faces hardened by war. They screamed her name, pounded fists against the walls, embraced one another with the kind of joy that only comes when death has been cheated. But Nova didn't rise. She sat slumped in the chair, her hands still resting on the dials, her breathing shallow. She had given everything, every calculation, every ounce of strength, every fragment of will. And now, as the bunker roared around her, she finally let herself feel the weight she had. Carried alone, Martinez crouched beside her, his voice low, almost gentle. "Ma'am, you did it." Her lips parted in the faintest ghost of a smile. "No," she whispered. "We did." Out on the battlefield, General Klov watched through binoculars as the dust settled, revealing the broken remains of his last tanks. His hands trembled not with fear, but with something colder. Disbelief. She crushed them, he murmured. His aides stammered beside him, words failing. Klov lowered the binoculars slowly. His iron wolves, his invincible division, destroyed not by technology, not by overwhelming firepower, but by one woman and her mind. His throat tightened as the bitter truth clawed at him. He had not been defeated by machines. He had been defeated by something far older, far stronger human will sharpened to a razor's edge. He gave the order no one believed they'd hear. Signal retreat, full withdrawal. His aide's voice cracked. "Sir?" Klov's eyes burned as he turned from the smoking horizon. "This is not a battlefield anymore. It's her ground. We will not take it." Back in the bunker, the celebration still thundered, but Nova barely heard it. Her mind was quiet now, her body empty. For hours she had fought with nothing but numbers and belief, carrying the impossible on her shoulders, and now that it was over, all that remained was silence. She stood slowly, every muscle heavy, and faced her soldiers. There, eyes shone with tears, their faces alive with something beyond relief. Faith in her, in themselves, in the idea that survival was possible, even against the impossible. Nova's voice was soft, but it carried through the bunker with a weight stronger than the cheers. "Remember this day, not for me, not for victory, but for what it means when everything fails, when machines die, when hope feels gone, we are still enough." The words settled deep into them, deeper than the fire, deeper than the cheers, and in that moment, they didn't see a commander or a savior. They saw a woman who had carried them through the dark, not with power, but with refusal to surrender. Outside, the desert was littered with burning wreckage, the ghosts of a division that had once been unstoppable. Thunder Ridge still stood, 2,000 soldiers still breathed. And at the center of it all sat the woman who had rewritten the laws of war with nothing but her mind. But even as they celebrated, even as the news spread like wildfire across the theater, Nova felt a quiet truth pressing at the edges of her heart. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning, because the real battle wasn't proving the impossible. It was teaching others how not to depend on miracles. Why was the line from Washington encrypted so heavily? The battle had ended hours ago, the desert now littered with burning metal and broken tracks. The cheers in Thunder Ridge had quieted into exhausted murmurs, soldiers slumping against walls, or collapsing into bunks, too drained to celebrate further. And yet, in the command bunker, a single secure channel flickered to life. Commander Destruction. The voice crackled through. Steady, formal, unmistakable. This is General Harrison. Every head in the room snapped up. Harrison wasn't just a general. He was the general head of the Pentagon's Missile Command, a man whose orders shaped wars on 3 continents. Nova rose slowly, her body heavy with fatigue, and saluted the blank screen as though he could see her. Sir. Harrison's voice carried no ceremony, no wasted words. We've been monitoring your engagement through satellite feeds. We know what you did. Nova's throat tightened. She had no idea how to answer that. Sir, He cut her off. You accomplished something military science considered impossible. Do you know what our analysts estimate your probability of success was? She shook her head. 0.001%. The silence after the number was deafening. Soldiers in the bunker exchanged stunned looks. Johnson's jaw fell open. Martinez blinked hard, as if the number itself was too absurd to hold. In his mind, Nova only exhaled. I did my job, sir. Harrison's tone sharpened. No, you did more. You did what computers were designed to do, by hand. You executed trajectory solutions that require supercomputers. You proved that human skill can achieve what we assumed only machines could, and that changes everything. The words hung in. The bunker like a verdict. Nova stood very still, her jaw tight, her chest aching with the weight of what he had just declared. Finally, she spoke. Sir, with respect, maybe we've been relying too much on the machines. They make us faster. Yes, more efficient, but they also make us weak, vulnerable. Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. When the systems fail, we fail. The silence stretched again. Then Harrison's reply came, measured but resolute. Effective immediately. You are being reassigned, not to another battlefield, to a classroom. That word hit her harder than any missile recoil. A classroom, sir? Yes, Commander. You will develop new protocols. Train officers across every branch. What you demonstrated today cannot remain with you alone. We need a military that can fight even when every circuit goes dark. We need to build resilience into the core of who we are. Her mouth went dry. The idea of leaving the front, of trading desert firestorms for lecture halls, struck something inside her she hadn't expected. Relief, yes, but also grief. A strange ache of unfinished duty. She answered softly. Understood, sir. The line went dead. No cheers followed. No celebration. Only silence, heavy and thoughtful. The soldiers in the bunker watched her, not as the woman who had saved them, but as someone being taken away. Martinez finally broke the quiet. Ma'am, you should be proud. Nova didn't answer. Pride was not what she felt. Pride was easy. What she felt was heavier, messier, a sense that the victory belonged less to her skill than to sheer necessity. She hadn't fought for glory. She had fought because there was no one else who could. And yet, that was enough. 3 weeks later, the war zone was behind her. Thunder Ridge became another name etched into reports. Another battlefield marked by wreckage and memory. Nova stood now in Washington, her uniform pressed, her boots polished, but her eyes still carried the desert. The War College loomed before her columns of white stone, banners hanging still in the summer air. A place where wars were not fought, but imagined. A place where soldiers became officers, where knowledge mattered more than blood. She walked its halls in silence, her footsteps echoing. Portraits of past commanders lined the walls, men and women immortalized in oil, faces stern, eyes sharp. Nova wondered if she belonged among them, or if she was only passing through. The classroom assigned to her was modest. Rows of chairs, a blackboard, a projector. She stood at the front, her hands resting on the lectern, staring at the empty seats. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move. She felt almost foolish, a soldier trained for chaos now preparing to speak in silence. Finally, she drew a deep breath. The lesson of Thunder Ridge, she whispered, as if practicing, is not that I am extraordinary. It is that we are fragile. Too fragile. Her voice gained strength as she imagined the faces that would soon fill the room. Technology is a tool, not a crutch. Computers can calculate faster than us. But they cannot improvise. They cannot adapt. They cannot think creatively under pressure. Those are human strengths. And when we forget them, we lose wars before they begin. She paused, staring at the chalk dust on her fingers. It felt almost poetic after the precision of dials and missile locks. To teach was something so simple. The door creaked open. The first group of officers filed in young, eager, nervous. They glanced at her with curiosity, some with awe, others with doubt. She recognized it instantly. The same doubt she had seen in Johnson's eyes, in Martinez's questions, in every soldier who thought her calculations impossible. It didn't offend her. It fueled her. She began simply, "Most of you think you know how to fire a missile. You've pressed buttons. You've trusted computers. You've watched screens do the work for you. But what happens when the screens go black? When the machines die?" The room was silent. Nova picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the board. She began writing equations simple at first, then layered, complex, building until the numbers stretched like a web across the surface. Her hand moved with the same rhythm it had in the bunker. But this time the result was not fire. It was understanding. "These aren't just numbers," she said softly, turning back to them. "They are survival. When you understand them, you can fight without machines. You can fight with nothing but your mind. That is the difference between surrender and victory." She set the chalk down. The students stared at her in silence, the weight of her words pressing into them, and in that silence, Nova felt something she hadn't on the battlefield. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, something steadier purpose, because the war she fought now wasn't measured in destroyed tanks. It was measured in minds prepared, futures saved, lives that would never need her miracle because they had learned to create their own. But even as she taught, as she poured herself into equations and theories, a shadow lingered in her chest, a question that gnawed at her when the classrooms were empty and the halls were silent. Had she been chosen for this because she succeeded, or because she survived? It was a question without answer, a weight she carried alone. And yet, as she walked the halls of the War College, as young officers saluted her with eyes brighter than they'd been before, she knew the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson, because one day, somewhere on another battlefield, someone else's screens would go black. Someone else would face the impossible. And if she had done her job, if she had taught them well, they would know what to do. They wouldn't need her miracle. They would make their own. Why did every screen on 3 continents go dark at once? It wasn't power failure. It wasn't storm or sabotage. It was war, the kind no one had fully prepared for. A cyber attack so sophisticated it spread like wildfire through networks, choking circuits, frying systems, leaving entire armies blind in the space of minutes. They called it the digital blackout. Missile systems froze mid-boot. Drones spiraled out of the sky. Ships in the Atlantic drifted helpless as radar screens died. Entire defense grids went silent. And in the chaos, enemy forces surged forward. Believing the West was paralyzed, for many units, they were right. Soldiers stared at dead consoles. Commanders shouted for backup that never came. Fear spread faster than the attack itself, but not everywhere. In a desert outpost far from Washington, a young lieutenant named Avery steadied his hands on a targeting dial. The room around him shook with artillery. Soldiers shouted, but his voice cut through the chaos. Calm, precise, impossibly certain. Range 12 miles, wind 7 knots. East, elevation +1. The missile roared. A fireball bloomed across the horizon. Cheers erupted. He didn't smile. He only adjusted again, whispering numbers under his breath, exactly as he had been taught, because years earlier he had sat in a classroom under The eye of Colonel Nova destruction, and he remembered her words. When the screens go black, you are still enough. Nova heard about the blackout, not from a secure line. Those were dead, but from a courier. Breathless, uniformed, dusty from travel, he burst into her war college office, slamming a hand against the desk. "Carl, ma'am, the systems are down everywhere. Europe, Asia, here. But your officers, they're fighting. They're holding ground. They're using what you taught them." Nova stood very still, the words washing over her. For a moment she was back in Thunder Ridge. The bunker dim, the controls cold beneath her hands. The world, demanding the impossible. Only this time, it wasn't her. It was them. She walked to the window, staring out across the green expanse of the college grounds. Cadets ran drills in the distance, shouting commands, rifles glinting in the sun, but beyond those drills, she imagined the battlefields alive right now with fire, chaos, and her students refusing to surrender. The courier's voice shook with urgency. "Colonel, NATO Command says without your training program, this would have been a massacre, but because of you, because of them, we're still standing." Her throat tightened. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because she understood something the courier couldn't yet. This wasn't her victory. It was theirs. Across Europe, reports echoed the same story at a besieged base in Poland. Captain Ruiz calculated missile arcs by hand, his chalkboard covered in frantic equations while shells shook the walls. Every shot landed true in the Mediterranean. A destroyer's fire control computers blinked out. Instead of surrendering, Ensign Carter ran manual bearings, her voice steady as she called corrections to the gunners. Their salvos struck home, driving enemy vessels back into smoke. In Africa, a forward unit's drone feed went dark. Instead of collapsing, a lieutenant drew firing patterns in the dirt with a stick, coordinating his squad to ambush armored vehicles with surgical precision. They were scattered across the world, but each carried the same imprint, the same discipline, the same refusal to surrender to silence. Each carried Nova's lesson. At the Pentagon, by candlelight in powerless halls, senior commanders gathered around paper maps, sweat beaded on foreheads. Voices snapped with tension, but over and over. Dispatches came in handwritten, courier delivered, but undeniable. Units trained in Nova's methods were holding. A general slammed his fist on the table. "She saved us, not the machines, her." Another shook his head, almost in disbelief. "No, she taught them to save themselves." The distinction mattered. Nova wasn't on those battlefields. She wasn't the miracle this time. She was the seed, and her students were the fire. At the War College, Nova didn't sleep. She sat alone in her office, a lamp burning low. Reports scattered across her desk. Each courier brought new stories, victories. One without computers, lives saved by officers who had once looked at her equations with doubt. Her hands trembled as she read them, not from fear, from something else. A weight lifting she hadn't realized she'd carried since Thunder Ridge. For years, she had asked herself the same question in the quiet hours. Was it luck? Was it only me? Now she had the answer. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't only her. Her miracle had become many. She closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt enough. On the front lines, the digital blackout raged for days, but where others faltered, Nova's officers endured. They fought not with machines, but with the oldest weapon of all, the human mind. Trained, disciplined, relentless. When the blackout finally lifted, when systems sputtered back to life and screens glowed again, the war was still raging, but the front had held. Historians would later write that the blackout could have been the greatest defeat of the century. Instead, it became proof of resilience, proof that one woman's refusal to surrender in a desert bunker had reshaped the doctrine of nations. But Nova herself didn't seek the history books when the power returned. When Washington buzzed with frantic praise and frantic plans, she slipped quietly back into her classroom. The chalk dust still clung to the board, equations half finished. From the day the blackout began still waited. Her students filed in, eyes wide, faces pale from sleepless nights of war. She looked at them for a long moment, her gray eyes softer now than they had been in Thunder Ridge, but no less sharp, and she said only this: "You proved me right." The silence after her words was heavy with meaning. Some smiled faintly, some lowered their eyes, some clenched fists with pride. Nova let it settle. Then she picked up the chalk and turned back to the board. "Now," she said, "let's learn what comes next." Because wars would change again. Technology would evolve. New crises would come. And one day, somewhere, another battlefield would fall silent as screens went dark. She knew that when it happened, her students or their students would be ready, and that was enough. Why did her office wall feel heavier than any battlefield? It was lined with commendations, medals, plaques, tokens of a career that others would call legendary. Yet Nova Destruction stood before them in silence, her hands folded behind her back, her gaze not on the polished frames, but on the spaces between them. Empty spaces. Spaces that reminded her of what had never been written, what had never been recorded. Because her story wasn't medals. It was silence. It was the moment when every machine had died and she had refused to. She reached out and touched one frame lightly. Not the highest medal, not the gleaming commendation. A simple handwritten note in a cheap frame. Its ink faded from time. "Thank you for teaching me. I don't need a computer to be precise. I just need to understand." It was from a young lieutenant years ago, long since deployed, long since lost to history's blur. Nova held the frame gently, her chest tightening. Of all the honors, all the words of generals, this was the one she treasured. Because it wasn't about her. It was about someone else carrying the fire forward. Behind her, footsteps echoed softly in the corridor. The door creaked. A young cadet, barely 20, stood uncertain in the doorway. His uniform was fresh, his eyes too wide for war, his hands clutching a notebook to his chest. "Colonel?" he asked nervously. May I ask a question?" Nova set the frame down and turned. "Always." The cadet swallowed hard, then blurted it out. "How did you survive Thunder Ridge?" "I've read the reports. I've studied the math. But how did you do it really?" Nova studied him for a long moment. His question wasn't about equations. It was about fear. The same fear she had carried into that bunker. The same fear every soldier carries when machines fail and the silence feels too heavy. She walked slowly to the chalkboard, still streaked with half-erased formulas. She picked up the chalk, rolled it between her fingers, then set it down again. "It wasn't about surviving," she said finally. Her voice was soft, thoughtful. "It was about refusing to surrender. Even when I believed I would fail, I couldn't let them see it, because 2,000 lives were looking at me. And sometimes—" "That's enough." The cadet frowned slightly. "So it was courage?" Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "No. Courage is what people call it afterward. In the moment, it just feels like weight. Heavy. Almost unbearable. But you carry it anyway. Because if you put it down, someone else has to pick it up. And maybe they can't." The cadet nodded slowly, writing furiously in his notebook. Though his hand trembled, Nova stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Don't chase my legend," she said quietly. "Chase the understanding. Learn the physics, the math, the discipline. Those are what matter. Legends fade. Knowledge endures." The cadet looked up at her, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am." She let him go. And when the door closed again, silence settled back into the room. That evening, she walked the college grounds as the sun dipped low. Cadets trained on the fields, their shouts echoing across the grass. Some stumbled, some argued, some pushed themselves past exhaustion. She watched them with quiet eyes, remembering herself at that age hungry, Restless, ignored at briefing tables, doubted by men who thought precision was a weakness. Now those same doubts had become her strength. She stopped at the edge of the field, watching as one young officer adjusted a makeshift targeting grid drawn into the dirt. His classmates laughed at the crude lines, but he ignored them, focused, muttering numbers under his breath. Nova's lips parted slightly. She recognized it. The rhythm. The same rhythm that had carried her through the blackout, through the desert, through the silence of a dead console, and she felt hope. Not the fragile kind born in bunkers, but the steady kind, the kind that takes root and grows in others, because the truth was simple. She was not the miracle. She had only been the proof. The miracle was that others could learn, that others could carry the weight when she no longer could. Years later, history would write her name into textbooks. Children would learn of Thunder Ridge, of the woman who destroyed 50 tanks with her bare calculations. Scholars would debate whether her mind was genius or anomaly, whether her methods could ever truly be replicated. But those who had sat in her classrooms, those who had heard her voice cut through silence, those who had seen her draw equations on the board with chalk-stained fingers, they knew the truth. It wasn't genius, it was patience, discipline, refusal, and something softer still. A belief that when everything else failed, humans were still enough. One evening, long after cadets had gone to bed, Nova sat alone in her office, pen in hand. Staring at a blank page, the lamp flickered. Outside, the night was quiet. The kind of quiet that reminded her of the bunker tents, endless, waiting. She began to write, not a manual, not equations, not orders, just words. A reflection, perhaps a legacy. Sometimes the strongest voice is silence, sometimes the greatest weapon is understanding, and sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She set the pen down, exhaled slowly, and leaned back in her chair. The words weren't for the world, they were for herself. And as the night stretched on, she felt something she had not in all her years of service. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, peace. Because she knew that somewhere on some distant battlefield not yet imagined, another young officer would face silence. Another soldier would stare at dead screens, at impossible odds, at the heavy weight of fear. And they would remember what she had taught. They would whisper the numbers. They would steady their hands. They would refuse to surrender, and that would be enough. The story doesn't end in fire. It doesn't end in explosions or banners. It ends in silence. A silence filled not with fear, but with resilience. The silence of a lesson carried forward. The silence of a mind stronger than machines. The silence of a dignity that never needed to be spoken. Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't the one the world celebrates. It's the one that endures when no one is watching. Nova Destruction understood that better than anyone, and somewhere out there, another hand was already turning the dials.